Monseigneur Lépine,
Monsignor Lépine, ladies and gentlemen,
depuis plusieurs jours, les Canadiens
for several days now, Canadians have been able to see, learn, and get to know the Mulroney family better. We now understand why Brian Mulroney was so devoted to his wife, Mila, and his children, Caroline, Ben, Mark, Nicholas, and their families. We thank you for having been so generous with us. We extend our condolences to you. In preparing my homage to Mr. Mulroney, I thought about an African proverb where the birth of each child is told in a story. Brian Mulroney is told through the story of his Irish roots and Baie-Comeau and the North Coast, and his role in Quebec and the construction of Canada. Taken all together, these stories determine his path. They help us to understand the love that he had for his family and the ambition that he continued to feed for his country. Brian Mulroney had politics in his blood. From New Brunswick to Nova Scotia and Quebec, and at St. Francis Xavier University and Université Laval, politics was always there in the background. He made connections through politics and through friendships, got to know his country. His career as a lawyer was his professional and political springboard. And this was where Brian met Mila, the love of his life. When he appointed me to his cabinet, he told me that he never would have become prime minister if it had not been for the support and love of his wife.
Elected leader of the Progressive Conservative Party in 1983, Brian Mulroney challenged its members, instilling discipline and preparing his party to govern. He won 2 commanding majorities. He was prime minister, and he would make it count. The Brian Mulroney that we saw from caucus and cabinet was, in the words of Theodore Roosevelt's famous speech of 1910, the man in the arena. Like that man, he was no timid soul who had never known victory or defeat. Brian Mulroney chose to spend his political capital. He took risks, and by doing so became one of those rarest of leaders, able to define an era as his own. He would remind us in caucus and cabinet that the #1 task of any prime minister was to keep the country united. In 1984, national unity meant that we needed to heal the wounds of the past and initiate constitutional reforms to bring us together. The second most important task of a prime minister was managing Canada's relationship with our neighbors, friends, allies, and in particular with our most important economic partner, the United States. Not an easy challenge for any prime minister for whom the neighbor happens to be the world's #1 superpower. And so he dared. He dared to defy the long history of Canada and negotiated a free trade agreement with the Americans. And to get this done, he was subjected to the test of a grueling and a punishing election campaign. To win in 1988, he brought together Albertans and Quebecers to support free trade. He did so because he knew that to build a great nation, the bridges between West and East, French and English, newcomers to Canada and the native-born could not and could never be taken for granted. His majority mandates that came from Canadians, were about change. Canada's economy was in dire need of a conservative overhaul. So, there would be fiscal reform and the GST. I can't think of a more unpopular economic policy than the implementation of the GST. And yet, I can't think of a more popular economic policy with all the prime ministers and governments that followed in the steps of Brian Mulroney. And he would do more. Privatizations, deregulation, expenditure reduction. His government would dismantle the national energy program in the West, and he'd sign the Atlantic Accord in the East. He concluded the largest land claims agreement in Canadian history and created the territory of Nunavut. Un des grands enjeux de notre époque,
one of the great challenges of our time was the environment. Pollution, climate deregulation, and the energy transition are, for our generation, existential issues. To the great surprise of observers in 2006, Brian Mulroney, a conservative, was recognized as being the greenest Prime Minister in Canada's history. We were one of the first countries in the world to have a green plan. Even before he was elected Prime Minister, he made acid rain one of the priorities of our relations with the United States. In 1991, he signed an agreement with George Bush on that subject, and it's one of the most successful environmental agreements in the world, but not the only one. In 1987, his government also negotiated the Montreal Protocol. I was with him at the Rio Conference in 1992, when Canada was the first G7 country to engage and sign on to the Climate Change and Biodiversity Convention. More than 40 years ago, Brian Mulroney understood that the environment was his generation's issue and was the responsibility of Canada to its future generations. And one of Mr. Mulroney's first great achievements in international politics, he brought Quebec through the great door of Francophonie by negotiating with Quebec Premier Marc Johnson and with French President François Mitterrand the creation of the International Francophonie Organization.
On the international stage, Brian Mulroney walked amongst the giants of the world. Reagan, Bush, Thatcher, Major, Mitterrand, Kohl, Nakasone, Abdou Diouf, Gorbachev, and others. Canada won a seat on the United Nations Security Council. We embraced peacekeeping. In 1991, Canada went to war, and we fought next to our allies in the Gulf. We played a crucial role as the Berlin Wall fell and a new world, including a new Europe, dawned. We were the first Western nation to recognize a free and proud Ukraine. And in one of his greatest moments, Brian Mulroney united all Canadians with pride and resolve as he and our nation helped Nelson Mandela take the first walk to freedom. His international contributions did not end when he left office. He contributed to offer invaluable advice, continued to offer invaluable advice and support to his successors. In the last weeks of his life, he entered the arena a final time, defending Israel and fighting anti-Semitism in a compelling speech he delivered in New York. L'aile parlementaire de son parti avait un rendezvous.
The parliamentary wing of his government had a meeting every Wednesday for the National Caucus. The most expected moment was when the leader took the floor. We were alone with him. He would go over the political events of the last week and would describe the meetings that he had with the great leaders of the world as if we had been there beside him in the room. He would also go over his upcoming meetings. He would share and sometimes tell us about some of his most intimate thoughts, his hopes, joys, and disappointments. He knew how to make us laugh and how to cry. He spoke to us of his family, his ambitions and plans for the country. He never missed an opportunity to tell us that he believed in us and that he loved us. And suddenly, the shadow of the bad polls disappeared and became radiant sunshine.
The Right Honourable Brian Mulroney treated his political opponents with respect. He did not view them as enemies. They were opponents, but most importantly, they were also Canadian patriots. Brian Mulroney had and was, and as was said, a hero named Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who when he passed away was described as having a heart made for friendship. Much has been said and reported about how Brian Mulroney would reach out to other people. And I know that there's not a person in this basilica today whose life has not been touched by Brian. I'll predict this. We will not have enough of our lifetime to hear all of the stories about when he reached out to friends, opponents, and people he had never met. He wanted to share with them what he knew to be true, that whatever the circumstances, things will come to pass. And as they strived to reach that day, they knew from having spoken to him that they were not alone and that they had his support and his friendship. For all of us who served under him, MPs, ministers, political staff, organizers, and public servants who he respected highly, there was no other place that we would have wanted to be. Here, now, at this very moment, we live in a world that he helped shape. We live in the country that he helped build. And because of Brian Mulroney, we live in one of the greatest countries in the world, Canada. So on this day, Canadians pay their respect and express their very deep gratitude to one of Canada's greatest prime ministers and one of Canada's true nation builders, Brian Mulroney.